Typically I don't do this, but I'm just making the Patreon video for this book public because I'm not going to do a better job of describing it than I did on Patreon. Crash is one of the most important and best pieces of fiction that I've ever read. It's one of the most challenging. It pushed me way out of my comfort zone as a book opinionator or book critic to try to explain my feelings about it, and I just don't want to go through that crucible again. So here you go. Also, I appeared on an episode of SF Ultra about Crash, and that one is free. It's linked in the description if you want to listen. It's 5 hours long. It's an opus. Sean is incredible, of course. There's also a link to my Patreon. It's $5. There's over 130 videos up there right now, including an 1.5 hour long Q&A video that I just published. So I think it's a good time to sign up if you're curious. If not, here you go. Apologies in advance if I am slightly harried during this interview. There we go. Off to a bad start already. I recorded a podcast with Sean of SF Ultra for SF Ultra this morning and was also tripping over my own words. Hopefully I won't have to edit this too aggressively. I'm harried and tired and crunched for time, and I want to get this interview out or get it recorded during this period of time because I have family members coming in for the holidays, and I would have to, drive out into the middle of nowhere, which is frankly a little bit of an ordeal, to record this interview. I said it sincerely again. I actually said an interview for real twice. Jesus. I would have to go out into deep space to talk out loud about Crash if family were around, because it's one of the most extreme pieces of fiction, not only that I have read, but that I can really imagine. It is up there with The Sluts by Dennis Cooper, maybe one volume notch lower than The Sluts, but if you don't want to hear talk of explicit sex acts, explicit transgressive sex acts, extreme violence, all the above, all the horrible things that you can imagine, don't watch this interview. Just skip it, because this is one of the craziest things that I've ever read. It's also one of the most important things that I've ever read, and part of this video is going to be me taking take two on the Drought review that I just shot a couple of days ago. And it was exhausting, and I put a bunch of work into it. And now I feel like not only is my opinion of the Drought under the shadow of new insights that I have into Ballard post-Crash, but I feel like all of my coverage of Ballard is now in question, at least to me, because I don't think that I really got what he was doing. Not that I can claim that I really get what Ballard is doing. The Ballard getter is not fully logged on, at least not yet, but I think I have a better sense for why Ballard writes in the style that he does, and it took me this long and it took me this book to catch on. So Ballard has a habit of writing novels that don't read like novels. They don't read like naturalistic fiction. They don't read like any other kind of fiction that I've read. They don't read like poetry. They don't read even like the weird stuff, the extreme stuff. Sean mentioned this during our talk, and I agreed that even though superficially it should read like The Sluts, Ballard and Dennis Cooper are doing fundamentally different things. Ballard's books, Crash included, all the books, all the novel-length fiction that I've read from him, just don't read like other stuff. And I interpreted that to be redundancy and over-reliance on symbolism and dryness, like narrative austerity, distance, remoteness. And I think all of those adjectives apply, but I didn't really get a sense of why that was happening or how much on purpose that was entirely a feature and not a flaw. Not that I thought that he was simply like an indulgent writer or pretentious or something like that, but I get the mission. I get why he was doing that. So Drought, I had a lot of trouble talking about and a lot of trouble reading because it's structured in this strange way where it's a sequence of images and it's a sequel. It's a sequence of like symbol objects, relationship maps between symbols that are constructed with words. and they seem to be mutually redundant, or like he seems to be reiterating the same thing many times, and it doesn't always make, in fact, very rarely makes for smooth reading. This is true, certainly of The Drought. If I were to reread Drowned World and Crystal World, I think that this would be my read of it as well, that it's not naturalistic fiction. I call Dr. Moreau Ballardian. It's not written like Dr. Moreau. It's not written, like I said, like anything else. And I read a review of The Drought where a guy was talking about Ballard's interest in surrealist painting, especially Salvador Dali, and how parts of The Drought are very surrealist, and how he uses surrealist imagery, especially in the third act, where he's in this desert and stuff lights on fire spontaneously and so on. I hadn't picked up on that, and I kind of borrowed, I think, an implicit note from that, or that sparked a thought that that's really what Ballard is doing, that it's not just representational fiction, it's not speculative fiction, it's something, it's a sequence of images that roughly are linear, that have the appearance of forward motion and plot, but they don't really, that sort of connective tissue, and it's really about his cogitation on the themes and the symbols, and his use of character is different than other people. In an interview where he was talking about Crash, he was saying that he just consciously disregards the idea of character, of or he said he portrays character as it's traditionally known, and as it's still discussed to be an artifact of bourgeois literature, something for which he has unbridled contempt, and a lot of his fiction is meant to disrupt the literary norms of like naturalistic fiction or social fiction. And his characters are meant to be, I don't remember the word that he uses, but basically just stand-ins. They're meant to be symbols in and of themselves, or placeholders for psychological archetypes. And Ballard was very interested in psychoanalysis, especially Freudian psychoanalysis. And he also said that his novels were meant deliberately to be unstructured. It's something that the reader is supposed to assemble given like a menu of symbols and themes, a menu of options of interpretation. I think if I had read more interviews with Ballard or watched more interviews with Ballard, then this, would have been more obvious, because he just explains the mechanics and the meaning of his fiction openly. In fact, he does that internally within his novels, especially in this, and Crash as well, but very conspicuously, he'll give you a symbol, and then one of the characters will meditate on the symbol and explicate its meaning, or one of its possible meanings. Another rather disorienting flourish in his fiction that is unlike other people. Crash forces you to confront this writing style. In fact, I had to take a break I had to take lots of breaks reading Crash because the subject matter is so extreme, because the style is so stylized, to be tautological. It's very off-putting at times. It's very difficult in a couple senses of the word. So I could only read it in chunks of 20 pages. Just incredibly, incredibly, incredibly intense. Crash is one of the most remarkable things that I've ever read. It'll stay with me absolutely forever, I think. And this, honest to God, I think has changed the way that I read fiction, or it's opened up another option for me to think about fiction. I've never seen anybody else do something with fiction that Ballard does in Crash, and it's hard to put into words. I'm looking at it. It is marketed as a brutal erotic novel. Another way to say that is that it is a piece of pornography, which is what Ballard called it. Ballard also said that pornography he considered the most inherently political art form, because it is about how we exploit one another, how we dominate one another, so on. It's to describe it as sexually graphic is to be a complete understatement. I mean, it is genuinely a piece of pornography. God damn, my brain is leaking out of my eye sockets right now, trying to think about how to begin, once again, to talk about Crash, how to put it into words. Can I do it? Can I explain Crash? Fuck. You probably know a little bit about what it's about if you've seen the movie. I've actually not seen the movie. I tried to watch it last night. You can't stream it anywhere because they don't want you to see James Spader getting it in. It is about, very roughly, a link between our experience of violence, especially our experience of violence as mediated through television and the news, and a link between sex and violence, or an overlaid layer of erotic interpretation to the aesthetics and the like geometry of the actual like physical infrastructure of auto collisions and of the construction of cars themselves. Cars as a universalizing metaphor for technology as such. And the book is a sequence of increasingly extreme and increasingly outlandish sex acts described in microscopic detail with a medical tone of voice and medical terminology. The book is about the relationship between sex and violence, which is something that, I don't know, isn't really that groundbreaking. I mean, you've seen that probably 100 million billion times, but there's something specific about the way that that metaphor, that cluster of symbols plays out in Crash. That is, the way that I phrased it to Sean was, I think even if you don't grasp, as I don't think I fully grasp the content of the symbolism or what specifically he is saying at any given point in the book, there's something about it that is immediately, instinctively identifiable and relatable in what he is saying in Crash, pointing to this intersection between like a person's interiority and also the way our interiority is not only influenced by the media, influenced by the material circumstances around it, but in a lot of cases potentially dictated by it. That our consciousness, I guess you could call it, is an externality of this media apparatus that surrounds us, and that the two things, our internal world and the exterior around us, are in, oh God, I get to use this word again, they're in a dialectical relationship one to another. Ballard called it a cautionary tale, although he also wonders out loud in interviews that maybe living in this kind of a world where we are at liberty to cultivate those private lives and in pursuit of every paraphilia available to us to cultivate an internal world in which we are free to engage with any level of psychopathy that is pleasurable to us at any time in any way. And Ballard said in interviews that maybe it's actually a constructive thing that we have personal relationships consciously with these forms of psychopathology that surround us, engage with them deliberately, and that maybe there is something important in that process that is part and parcel of progress itself. And this is a point that he makes again in Supercon. But it seems to me, or maybe it's just, you know, what I want to believe, that I think that that's something that Ballard worries about more than prescribes. And I think that for the most part, this book is Ballard worrying about what he sees in the media, this sort of like voyeuristic, you know, this is like not a thing that's, I think, that groundbreaking to hear, that, you know, we're activated by violence that we see through the media in some way that is unhealthy, or that we have a voyeuristic relationship to it. But there's something in Crash where the boundary between perception and action is totally dissolved, where the characters stop even being able to identify their reaction to the violence and sex that comes to them through their televisions from actual sex acts that they're performing on one another in person. And this is a constant theme of people performing elaborate sex acts, often that are mimicking the postures of corpses that they find at crash sites, especially these two main characters, one of whom is named James Ballard, the protagonist, and one of them is named Vaughn, who's sort of like masculine archetype, who's a man who goes to car crash sites to film details of them in order to construct a script of the perfect auto wreck that he wants to have in an act of suicide, this act of like, personal transcendence, where he will penetrate through the other side of the screen and kill Elizabeth Taylor. And these two men have many different sexual partners over the course of the book. And they, as they are having sex in cars and moving cars, they see the world outside the windows, and they change the positions that they have sex in order to be in harmony with the things that they see outside, like the architecture and the landscape, most of which is this bleak, industrial, like suburban, kind of warehousey, you could call them liminal spaces, sort of an external world that is totally uniform. It reminded me a little bit of Kathy Koja. It reminded me, obviously, a lot of High Rise and Concrete Island as well. Reminds me a lot, honest to God, of Southern California, which I think is maybe the most Ballardian place on earth outside of Shepperton, where this is set and where he lived. So these characters, the boundaries are just constantly shifting between themselves and others, and also with the world, with their fantasies, and with the material that they're confronted with, especially details of auto wrecks that are again described in extreme detail, and like parts of cars described in a way that they're like completely atomized one from another, where he'll describe steering columns and the like leatherette seats or sections, or like stitching in the seams of the leather seats. And these descriptions are intermixed with descriptions of body parts and sex acts, and it all blends together, even to the point of, towards the end of the book, as these characters get more and more lost and more like mentally diffuse into the world, of coming to see auto wrecks themselves as fundamentally indistinguishable from actual physical sex with other people. I think maybe I'm understating how much of this is erotic content, is just description of sex acts, and it's description of sex acts that is extremely clinical. Ballard was a medical student for 2 years and has incredible stories about dissecting cadavers. And it's not just clinical, it's almost hyper-clinical. Not like it's, fangless or anodyne, but it's almost like the body parts themselves are animated. The most striking example of this, I think, is his description of semen, or of ejaculation, where the male characters don't ejaculate. It's like the semen has its own life. It's like a weird animal that lives inside of them and happens to like transit out of their urethras. If you think that this description is gross, is too much, then this truly is just the tip of the iceberg. I think one of the things probably that is most notorious about Crash is its fascination with wounds incurred in auto collisions. And those wounds come to be described as new sexual orifices. The basic, just biological mechanics of sex are like remade in the book, and interspersed with this paraphilic fascination with cars. And it says, it at one point describes it as like a new, like a new sexual language on the hunt in search of expression, where it's not something that the characters are doing, it's something that is like happening to them. And the world, or like the world of technology, is this unlimited frontier of like moral debasement that is available to the characters, and as they go further into it, they become more violent, more extreme, and more nihilistic, until they're complete psychopaths. And this isn't portrayed as like individual moral failing on the part of the characters. This is a reflection, a mutual reflection between them and the world at large. And there's this amazing, I think probably one of my favorite quotes, maybe my favorite quote from the book. "The deviant technology of the car crash provided the sanction of any perverse act, For the first time, a benevolent psychopathology beckoned towards us, enshrined in the tens of thousands of vehicles moving down the highways, in the giant jetliners lifting over our heads, in the most humble machine structures and commercial laminates. And I don't know, again, maybe this is because I come from a very Ballardian part of the world, but that phrase, benevolent psychopathology, was extremely resonant with me. There is a special kind of alienation that I feel that one maybe could call Ballardian, I don't know, but that notion of there's something in the air, this ambient feeling of just living in an anti-human world, and a specifically technologically driven anti-human world. And it's a world of nominal progress in the absence of grander, like, moral projects or a promise of our interiority actually being improved instead of just being kind of like exploited and sullied. This is a debasement that we all share together. And there's another amazing quote: "The enormous energy of the 20th century, enough to drive the planet into a new orbit around a happier star, was being expanded to maintain this immense, motionless pause." One of my favorite sentences I've ever read. At this point, can anybody doubt that he was on the money with this, with his idea of like, well, we just kind of live in this sort of nihilistic void in which our personal, like, mental recreations and erotic fixations have created a world that is increasingly worse? I don't think anybody in the world still believes in this old 1950s, like, technologically optimistic, teleological view of the world of we're just inherently on this. Well, I'm saying this, but then I'm remembering some of the stuff that I've heard out of Silicon Valley. So I don't know, that stuff still lives on, but the average person on the street, do they feel that they are not in a moment of pause? Do they feel that they are on track to live in a better world simply by merit of our increasing exposure to increasingly like intimate technologies? Crash is one of the most amazing books I've ever read. Not only do I think there has never been, at least that I have read, a more perfect encapsulation or illustration of the perverse relationship, the extreme interpenetration between human psychology and technology as Crash. I don't think anybody has ever done it. I also don't think anybody will do it better than this. I think it is done so well that I think almost this book obviates the need for cyberpunk to have ever happened. I think that this says this point so incredibly well that it makes the rest of literature that has followed it kind of redundant. I said this was a dual review video about The Drought as well. The Drought is an earlier disaster novel. It's his second after Drowned World. That's about an ecological catastrophe that creates a layer of polymers on the surface of the ocean that makes it impossible for ocean water to evaporate, disrupts the water cycle, and there's a protagonist character living on a houseboat who sees the apocalypse coming, sees this immense drought coming, and leans into it, yearns for its arrival as, once again, the world around him devolves into various forms of savagery and psychopathy. I think I shouldn't say that much more about The Drought or that much more about other Ballard because I need more time to think about Crash. And I think Crash is so powerful and it's so important that I feel like I need to reread the other Ballard before having an opinion about it. Or like the way that I read Crash is so different than the way that I read the other books. And I feel like I must have missed a lot. I feel like I did not fully get what was going on, as I said. So I don't want to opinionate about Ballard too much, other than to say, like, I don't think I've ever loved more an experience of being made to feel incredibly uncomfortable, of like attacked as a reader. It's an extremely aggressive book, Crash is, an extremely hostile book in a lot of ways. and it's one from which there is no escape. I know that this is really trite, and it's even, kind of trite given what happens in part of Crash, but I liken it to a psychedelic experience in its inescapability of there's nowhere to go while you're reading Crash. There's nowhere to go other than like a direct, visceral, intense, personal negotiation with these things. It's something that you either have to proactively engage with or not read. This review is actually coming out of order. I read The Drought a while ago, and then I finished Crash pretty recently, and there's a few books in between them, but I wanted to shoot this now, also because this is a book that I really like. If I don't do it justice, I feel a sense of failure as like a critic or someone who advocates for books. Like, this is one that I feel that I need to do justice. So I didn't want to wait too long. Goes without saying, I recommend it. Although I, once again, want to say that it is some of the most disturbing content that I've ever read or that I can imagine. This is the deep darkness. Haven't read that much transgressive or extreme lit, but this is right at my limit. My limit may be lower than certain other people, but know that going into it. It genuinely is a nightmare set to the page. And it's one of the best books I've ever read.